In the military, we refer to exemplary officers as an officer and a gentleman. And if you ask me to name one very senior officer who I consider as an officer and a gentleman, without batting an eyelid, I would say it is Lieutenant General Densil Kobbakaduwa. But I need few more words to be added to that term, an officer and gentleman. In my observation, late General Kobbakaduwa was indeed an officer and a gentleman par excellence, and also a true leader and a patriot, and a great and a brave son of Sri Lanka. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Lali Kobbakaduwa and the family, Secretary of Defense, General Kamal Gunaratne, Secretary, Ministry of Public Security, General Jagat Alvis, Commander of the Navy, and senior officers from other services, and retired flag rank officers, and my colleagues and dear friends, good evening once again. It's indeed a great honor for me to be invited to deliver the Lieutenant General Densil Kobbakaduwa Memorial Oration in front of this august gathering organized by the Institute of National Security. Now, Institute of National Security, as we heard a little while ago, is the premier think tank dealing with national security of this country. So therefore, I am delighted to be in front of you and talk to you about a hero and also about international relations and national security. I don't think I can mention and talk about General Kobbakaduwa without refreshing your memories about the conflict we had in this country. Now, it is time that we refresh our memories, but with the intention not to dwell upon it, but to move on. So, ladies and gentlemen, we know this small country was engulfed in a prolonged, protracted, violent armed conflict for nearly 3 decades. And the enemy that we fought was declared as the most ruthless terrorist organization in the world. And I would say, when you analyzing the organization and the activities of other terrorist outfits in the world, no one come even closer to the atrocities committed by the LTTE. The LTTE killed large number of Tamil political figures, academics, intellectuals, religious dignitaries, ordinary people on both sides. And they also killed civil society activities, they killed 2 world leaders, and they killed 600 policemen who surrendered to them on the instruction of the government. No place in the country was safe. Public places, places of religious worship, financial institutions, transport, public transport, nowhere it was safe. And we need to remember that the LTTE killed 1,600 soldiers of the Indian military also. So this was the enemy that this government, this country had to fight. Unlike any other terrorist organization, the LTTE was able to fight battles on land, at sea, and from air. No other terrorist organization in the world has achieved these three domains of operation like the LTTE. LTTE pioneered the suicide vest, suicide bombers, suicide boats. Others copied them much later. So you can imagine the battle that we fought. And to date, the LTTE had the most extensive, in-depth terrorist financing and money laundering network. Al-Qaeda, ISIS are babies when you consider the terrorist financing network of the LTTE. So this was essentially an internal armed conflict, but we do see there are a lot of elements from other countries in this battle as well. There were a number of negotiations, mediations, ceasefire agreements, monitoring missions, peacekeeping force. But at the end of everything, the LTTE became stronger. They gained more people, more equipment, more ground, more intelligence, and they created a lot of destruction. Now, the LTTE was considered as undefeatable by majority of countries, and we were advised that a military solution is the only way. You can never ever defeat the LTTE. However, the government of Sri Lanka was able to finally defeat this most ruthless terrorist outfit in the soil of Sri Lanka. When you look at the determinants of success, the political leadership, political resolve, modernizing and synergizing armed forces and police and other elements, creating a whole of country approach, uplifting the soldier to a very higher state as Ranaviru. All these things contributed in the final victory. When the government of Sri Lanka, with a clear objective and a clear vision, with our brave army and supported by other services, took the battle to the LTTE, the mightier than thou LTTE started crumbling. Within a span of 2.5 years, a militant outfit which was considered the best in the world crumbled like a pack of cards. Now, why I mention this, ladies and gentlemen, to lead to my talk today. During this nearly 3 decades, we have had many heroes. We have had many figures that we remember. We have many figures we venerate. We have many figures we remember with gratitude. And they were true heroes and true patriots. And some of them made the supreme sacrifice in defense of the motherland. There are many who led from the front. There are many who stand out as heroes. Among these many, ladies and gentlemen, in my observation, Lieutenant General Denzil Kobbakaduwa stand out among all these heroes that sacrificed their supreme life. General Kobbakaduwa stand tall. So that is why I mentioned about the terrible conflict we had. Like what Dimuthu said, let me also share a brief interaction that I had and some of my observations about this great hero. This was on the 8th August 1992, myself and another officer were traveling in a small Maruti Jeep from Colombo to Katunayaka or to Nigambu. And I can't remember how, but we picked up an army soldier to give him a lift up to Nigambu. When he got onto the vehicle, he said that he heard a news that General Kobbekadua and a group of senior officers were caught up in some explosion and they were evacuated to the medical care. Those days there was no breaking news, there was no WhatsApp, there was some basic telephone. I can't even remember whether I had a telephone. So the message was not read properly. We did not know what happened. We did not know how it has happened. But then we were shocked because General Kobbekadua was one person. The entire country had hopes that he would deliver this country from clutches of terrorism. The soldier, after a brief moment of silence, said, "Me katawa ඇත්තනම් අපි ඉඳලා වැඩක් නෑ sir. මේ යුද්ධය අපිට දිනන්න බෑ." This is what this soldier told me. I never knew who he was. I never asked for his name. And we were really shocked. That incident, to my observation, changed the history of Sri Lanka. If that incident did not take place, the history of the conflict would have been written differently. We know that it was on the eve of a major operation. The government, the armed forces were planning to launch to liberate Jaffna Peninsula. We don't know how this incident happened. We heard even a conspiracy theory. We don't know whether it was a pure accident. I think even the LTTE was taken by surprise, because this is not something that they ever hoped to achieve, but they did achieve. So ladies and gentlemen, on that fateful day, we lost a great hero, a great human being, a great military leader that we all looked up to save the country from the clutches of LTTE terrorism. And at that time, the general was in his prime youth of 52 years of age. And he was the overall operations commander for Northern Sector. I think it was referred to as Second Div Commander. There were other military officers who perished, who paid their supreme sacrifice on that day, and we had worked with some of them. Admiral Mohan Jayamaha, he was my commanding officer in SLNS Karenaga, Ilara base in Karenaga. And Colonel Stephen or Brigadier Stephen, I have known him from my school team. Incidentally, he and I dated two girls from the girls' high school athletics team, but we both got married to them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my memory also goes back to Operation Balavegaya. Now, on July 10th, 1991, Elephant Pass came under siege by the LTTE, and they launched an operation called Operation Charles Anthony. Charles Anthony, incidentally, was the first suicide cadre of the LTTE. 800 troops of the 6th Battalion of Singha Regiment under Major Lalit Buddhadasa was besieged in the Elephant Pass army camp. The LTTE had surrounded the army camp at Elephant Pass. Now at that time, General Kobbekadua decided for the first time in the history of Sri Lankan military to launch an amphibious operation. We have done other work with our landing forces, but never an amphibious operation. So he wanted to establish a beachhead and to rescue the camp, Elephant Pass Army Camp, and to link it with them. I remember he was operating from Anuradhapura at that time, and then he said that we have to establish a beachhead in a place closer to the Elephant Pass Army Camp on the north and east coastal area. 8,000 troops were identified, and the staging location was declared as Pulmude. I, as a very young lieutenant commander, commanding one of the landing craft, together with Rear Admiral Ruan Dias, 2 landing craft were sent to Pulmude. When we approached Pulmude, we saw General Kobbakaduwa sitting on a shooting stick and directing huge machinery, front-end loaders, to build a temporary pier so that the landing craft can come and take the items on board. So I had that impression, here is a military leader not really directing other people to work, but he is there, supporting others, guiding others. He was there. And then we launched this operation. The first day we could not land. The second day we did land in a place called Vettilakerni, and quickly a beachhead was established. And then after several days of fighting, a main supply route was established between the besieged Elephant Pass Army Camp and Vettilakerni, and the soldiers trapped in the camp were rescued. At that time, this was one of the longest battles because it was going on for a long time, and 573 LTT cadres were killed, and 202 soldiers also paid the supreme sacrifice. Now, I, as a young lieutenant commander, was carrying troops, ammunitions, armored cars, artillery, rations, medicine, soldiers from Pulmude to Vettilakerni beachhead. On one day, during the landing, we received a message asking to come and meet General Denzil Kobbakaduwa. When we went there, we were expecting to see a very nicely dressed up military commander. What we saw was a very simple, humble person wearing a white color sarong and a vest. And he greeted us and he asked us to come into his tent. He asked 3 questions in a rapid succession. How are you, son? Was the first question. Have you had breakfast? Was the second. What can the army do for you? Was the third. That impression he created at that minute is still lingers in my heart as a great military leader, but a human being. Now, General briefed, as Dimuthu said, that these 2 young officers, he briefed the situation. He didn't have to do it. I mean, we were doing just a job, but he briefed the situation in detail and what his plans are. Then he said a very important message. He said, now onwards, you 2 take orders only from me, because I am here and 75% of my battle will be logistic, and you take orders from me in this operation. And that is exactly what we did for the next 30 days, because the Balaweghe phase 1 was nearly 31 days. So ladies and gentlemen, why I narrated this story is because that is an impression created in my mind, which I don't have any other incident to narrate in this nature for my 36 years. He showed us how a very senior military leader can be a great leader, a humble person with a humanity and a humane approach. And he also showed us how to lead from the front, how to care about the men he commands, and how to keep the country at heart. So then, my gratitude to Madam Lali Kobbekaduwa for being here. Maybe, Madam, you were wondering what is this naval officer going to talk about, General? Maybe he doesn't have any interaction, but now you know, as a very junior officer, I had an interaction, and I shared that with you to highlight the great qualities of late General Kobbekaduwa. So let me now, with this long introduction and preamble, shift my talk to the key theme today, intersection of foreign policy and national security of Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, when you talk about national interest or foreign policy starts at the national level. Foreign policy of a country starts at the national level. There are a lot of internal and external dynamics influencing the foreign policy of a country. Also, the foreign policy executive, in our case, it is His Excellency the President, the government, the people shape the foreign policy of a country. There are internal factors and there are external factors determining our foreign policy. History of a country has a very strong bearing on determination of foreign policy. Know your history before you look to the future. This is a simple theory. Know your history before you look to the future. Foreign policy is also driven by the position of the country in the international system, the relative position of the country. And it is also dependent on the material power that country has. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka, one may say, oh, we don't have natural resources, we don't have oil and gas. But look around us. We are blessed with such a green country, high biodiversity, a deep blue ocean around us. These are extremely valuable national assets. So we have quite a lot of things. Now, when you are dealing with foreign relations, diplomacy is the main tool that we use, because that is how the foreign policy of a president, of a government, is translated into action in the international system. And therefore, the diplomat is very important cog in the wheel. That is why His Excellency the President is very carefully selecting diplomats to serve the country, because they represent the voice of Sri Lanka abroad and in international forums. That is their main task. Now, ladies and gentlemen, right now, Sri Lankan foreign policy is mainly focused on surviving in this international system, but focusing on economic diplomacy. How do we make some foreign exchange to the country, economic diplomacy. Now, let me also talk about, typical to Sri Lanka, some of the factors determining the national interest in the international domain. The Pacific Commander in 2016, Admiral Harry Harris, when he came to Sri Lanka to address the Galle Dialogue 2016, he mentioned Sri Lanka has three clearly distinct advantages. Number one, location. Number two, location. And number three, location. Now, therefore, this location, the geographical location of this country is of critical importance in all what we do. We cannot forget that. Sometimes we feel that this geographical location is a blessing. Sometimes we feel it is a curse. But still, this is critically important in the Indian Ocean. And if you look at Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean, we are equal distance from the eastern coast and the western coast of the Indian Ocean. We are at the center, and we are the southernmost landmass in Asia in the Indian Ocean. And we are so close to one of the fastest developing economies in the world, with a population of 1.34 billion, with a coastline of 7,500 kilometers, that is India. And also we are extremely close to one of the most busiest sea lines of communication, shipping line across the Indian Ocean, just 12 nautical miles south of our country. So therefore, geostrategically, geoeconomically, Sri Lanka is in a very important location. And we have to live with this important location. We have to make it work for Sri Lanka. We have to use this location in the international domain to benefit Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, right now we are experiencing a different world. The world that we had before 2020 was dawn is no more. And I doubt whether the pre-COVID world will ever come back. I'm not sure. Because in 2019, we spoke about enhancing globalization, more connecting, visa-free travel, people-to-people connectivity, more trade, more global supply chain activities. But what did we get during the last 2 years? Instead of globalization, we got slowbalization. Instead of free travel, we got lockdowns, airport closure, restrictions to travel. So different. And now, of course, we are coming out of this situation, and this has given rise to a new form of diplomacy in the world. That is the health diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy. Now, these are the new forms of diplomacy in the world. When you look at the Indian Ocean, the location of Sri Lanka, our international relations, we cannot forget the dynamics in the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean is a vital ocean. It's becoming the most important ocean in the 21st century, undoubtedly. But there is a huge strategic competition in this ocean. Major powers and aspiring major powers are trying to dominate the Indian Ocean. This gives rise to a strategic competition and some strategic convergences, and for smaller countries like Sri Lanka, a strategic dilemma, because we can't choose, we can't bandwagon. We need our strategic autonomy, but how do we maintain it amidst this major power game? We can only say that Sri Lanka is important to everyone. Sri Lanka is important to all the major powers and all aspiring major powers in the Indian Ocean. Historically, Sri Lanka had been important, and in today's context, in the 21st century, Sri Lanka is critically important. When we talk about the Indian Ocean trade, we know the figures: 70% of world energy, 50% of world containers, and 35% of bulk cargo are transported across the Indian Ocean. And that is for the world. Majority of that is passing very close to this island nation called Sri Lanka. And therefore, we are in an important location, but at the same time, we are in the axis of influence, spheres of influence, direction of focus of all these countries. So we are under the microscope of all the major powers within the Indian Ocean. We see increased militarization in the Indian Ocean. At any given time, there are about 120 warships belonging to about 28 different nations patrolling in the Indian Ocean. And we don't know how many submarines are there, we don't know how many aircraft are there, we don't know how many underwater, unmanned underwater vehicles are there. There are large number of military units in the Indian Ocean. So what Admiral Mahan said more than 100 years ago, that in the 21st century, key to the world will be the Indian Ocean. That prophecy is coming true. So how we handle this is going to determine the fate of Sri Lanka in the near term as well as in subsequent periods. Now, when you look at the Indian Ocean, it is not only the major powers competing each other, resulting in a chaotic situation for maritime security. There are large number of non-state actors, be that pirates, human smugglers, terrorists, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishermen. There are large number of non-state actors present in the Indian Ocean as well. So with this situation, how do we move our ship, Sri Lanka, in the Indian Ocean, keeping our national security as a top priority is a Herculean task. But this is something we cannot evade. We can't escape from this attention. We have to face it. During my lectures, I compare this situation, I call it the pretty girl syndrome. That is, this pretty girl called Sri Lanka is there. She's receiving a lot of gifts. America gives a warship, China gives a warship, India built 2 warships, Japan gives 1, Australia gives warship. We are receiving, this pretty girl is receiving lots of gifts, like in the case of any other pretty lady. So this lady is little clever. She doesn't give the word to anyone. She smile at one, she blink at one, she wink at one, she flirt a little. But then this situation sometimes can be dangerous. Finally, she may be able to find the best partner and settle down, or lose them all. So this is exactly the situation that Sri Lanka is in. So in this backdrop, His Excellency the President has 3-pillar strategy for Sri Lanka. The 3 pillars are: number 1 is national security, and number 2 is economic development, and number 3 is foreign relations. In that order: national security, because without national security, nothing can be achieved. We know the Easter bombing, how neglected we were. Now, thank God, I think, out of the 3 priorities, national security under the able leadership of my great friend General Kamal Gunaratne and of course other supporting, we have achieved national security. But then economic development, we are yet to achieve. The COVID has destroyed it. COVID has really impacted heavily on our economy. And foreign relations, we are there, but we need economic development. All these three pillars, national security, economic development, and foreign relations, all the areas need to go together. Although we have achieved great results in national security, unless the other two are met as a country, it's difficult for us to survive. Now, when you look at the Indian Ocean today, there are some very strange things happening in the world, not necessarily the Indian Ocean. Recently, there was a democracy summit and inviting 100 world leaders. Now, 100 world leaders mean there are 93 world leaders who are not invited, including Sri Lanka, right? So that is 51.8% of the world were invited, but Sri Lanka was not invited. Now, I'm not going to criticize this decision, but some countries with extremely poor human rights records, extremely non-democratic forms of government were invited. So it's very difficult for us to understand how this division, democratic, non-democratic, does this mean that we are not a democratic country? Is the question. To my observation, Sri Lanka is one of the oldest functioning democracies in the world, and definitely so in Asia. Now we conduct regular elections, we elect our leaders, all our elections are certified as free and fair by maybe European monitors, and we are committed to human rights, and we have complete freedom of speech. I can say anything I want. Our press is going to town with even a simple thing because they have the freedom of speech. So to me, we have practically all tenets of democracy. However, now we are labeled as undemocratic. We have a very great, robust judicial system, free and fair justice system, but we are now considered in a different way. So we have to now redefine what is democracy. But I think it should be the people of a country who should decide what is their form of governance. What do they want? Not someone telling us. There cannot be one size fit all for all the countries to follow. It won't work. We have to find out what is best for us. Now, when you talk about democracy, this has a relation to the foreign relations as well. There are certain negative aspects of democracy Sri Lanka is experiencing. There are 4 negative connotations that we have taken. That is short-termism. You know, our election cycle is very short. You know, for you to have a long-term plan, 5 years is not enough, right? So therefore, short-termism is one peril of democracy. Risk aversion, because we are having a very short term, the governments cannot take bigger risk. Division, we are divided 51% and 49%. And the 49% always want the country to fail so that they can come back to power. 49% always want to criticize what the government is doing. So this is democracy. And the final one is the political apathy. Now we select our leaders, but we don't want to play a bigger role in other than voting, right? So democracy is great. We like democracy, but there are negatives as well. So my point is, the world needs to be united. The world needs to be inclusive and not dividing ourselves into exclusive clubs. This is my point. Because there are certain threats that the entire world is engulfed with and common to the entire world. Pandemic. Is it only for one country? No. It is common for everyone. Global warming, climate change, sea level rising, extreme weather events. Is it only for Sri Lanka? I think about 2 weeks ago, there was a very powerful tornado in Kentucky, America. More than 100 people were killed and entire cities were destroyed. So this global warming is real, and impact we are feeling. And we have to address them as a world, not as divided clubs. Natural disasters, then poverty alleviation and economic development. If somebody thinks only Sri Lanka is having this economic trouble, no, many countries are having. America did not have enough turkey to eat during the Thanksgiving because the supply chain didn't work. So it's not only Sri Lanka, everywhere there are problems. But we know it, we feel it because we live in this country. Then another threat is technology. Technology is a great thing, right? But if someone is abusing it, misusing it, that will be a threat. Whether it is artificial intelligence, face recognition, cyber, big data, all these things are great things. But if someone decides to abuse it, then it can be a bigger threat to a country. Then, of course, religious extremism and terrorism. We are not immune from what is happening. The perfect example is Easter bombing. We had nothing, as a country, nothing to do with ISIS ideology, but then we became victims. Then, of course, transnational crimes like drugs, human, weapon, then other illegal activities, and preventing of pollution. All these things need a common approach. All these things are important for common survival, and not what we don't want mutually destroy each other, but we want to survive as one world and one common objective. So therefore, we need to survive in this scenario. We have to have our foreign policy directed towards understanding this and overcoming these difficult times. We have to keep national security in top mind. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me also briefly touch upon the human rights and Sri Lanka. You know, very unfortunately, we are being accused of large-scale human rights violation. We know that by being born human, we have rights. We have the right to eat, we have the right to breathe, we have the right to have water, because we are born as human. That is very important for all of us. We need to have a free life. We need the freedom of our speech. All that is good. But I have a question. Which is more important, human rights or right to life? Now, terrorists, religious extremists destroy the life. They kill people arbitrarily, indiscriminately. They plant a bomb and kill everyone. They are not giving right to life. They are killing people. So that is why I ask the question, what is more important, human rights or right to life? I'll give you an example a little later. To me, human rights is like a flower. You have to plant a seed, let the tree grow, and then you get the flower. Without the tree, there cannot be a flower. And I compare this to development. Without developing a country, you cannot only talk about human rights. You have to first develop the country, then you can allow the basic needs of the people to be met and enjoy other things. So we need to grow. That is the development. Now, I ask you a question, what is more important, human rights or right to life? Let me share a very brief analysis of casualty figure during the conflict. If you say we started the conflict in late 70s, culminating on 19th May 2019, per month, this country was losing around approximately 250 lives. LTTE, Army, Tamil, Sinhala, Muslim lives. 250 human beings were killed, roughly. 19th May 2009 to date, it's zero. Of course, we had the Easter bombing, but I'm not dragging Easter bombing into that. So that means the government has given right to life to its people, because No one is now dying because of a conflict. Don't you think that is more important? Don't you think that is critically important that we all know that Colombo was not a safe place. We can't even sleep because there can be a light aircraft coming and bombing the city, right? So government perform a mandatory duty given by the constitution of this country to protect its people. But the irony of it is now we become the bad guy now because we have given rights to the people. Now the terrorists have become good guys, and the legitimate government and the valiant military which fought this brutal terror regime are considered as bad guys. So in this world, I have to say, although the LTTE was comprehensively, militarily defeated on the soil of Sri Lanka, it is not yet over. Now the battleground has shifted. Now the weapons have changed. Earlier it was artillery, mortars, explosive. Now it is not that. Now the weapons are campaigning, propaganda, litigation, and lobbying. Now these are the weapons that are being used against Sri Lanka. We have not committed any crime. We have never ever committed human rights violations. We all know that on the 19th May 2019, when the conflict finally ended, 295,000 people escaped from that area and came to our military. Did we harass them? No, our soldiers gave their ration pack to these people. Our soldiers gave their medicine to these people. Our soldiers became their savior. That is the transformation. Until that time, they were fighting against each other. But when the war ended, the soldier became the guardian of the people. So that is the humane approach that we have. But unfortunately, we are taken to task. However, ladies and gentlemen, it is not that easy for the LTTE front organizations also. Now, the European Union very recently continued or gave a directive. The European Union General Court in Luxembourg said, although the LTTE is militarily defeated, they are engaged in terrorist financing, and therefore the ban on the LTTE should continue. So we have a huge task in that. Now we are making our reports, we are making our reply to the human rights accusation with facts and figures, but they are not ready to listen. They say, oh, you have violated human rights. And now there is even a special mechanism set up in Geneva to punish us. And they say we have 120 pieces of evidence against what? Where is natural justice? Where is due process of law? If I accuse you of something, I have to tell you what that accusation is. I have to tell you what is the evidence that I have. Nothing like that. We are just being accused. Now, therefore, we believe that we are ready to work with these international organizations. We have created some domestic mechanisms. We have a commission of inquiry headed by a sitting judge of the Supreme Court. Then we have an Office of Missing Person, Office of Reparation, Office of National Unity and Reconciliation, SDG, Sustainable Development Goal Council, Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. We are all working together. We are empowering them to act independently. We have to agree that there are certain residual issues coming out of the prolonged conflict. We need to address them. We have to find answers. We have to push them, put them behind and move on. So we have to respond to our international community, and we say we uphold the UN Charter to the spirit and letter. We do that. We respect the international charter. But then you have to respect sovereignty, independence of this nation also. So it has to be a mutual respect. While we work to the letter and spirit, you have to respect our sovereignty. Now, we do everything, but we don't accept this mechanism set up in Geneva. We are not the worst country on earth. Relatively, I think we are really a good country. We are a peaceful country. You take the South Asian region, this is the best country. This is the most peaceful country. Everywhere we know, I don't want to name the names, it's not fair. But Sri Lanka is a peaceful country, right? But we need to move on. Now, that is why the President is very determined to address these issues and to work with the international community and with a clear mind to steer them. Now, in this endeavor, I'm so happy to acknowledge that Secretary Defense, Secretary Public Security, Justice Ministry, Attorney General, and the Foreign Ministry, these 5 institutions work as one team addressing these issues. I have never seen 5 institutions working so closely together in a great coordinated way. So we have set that, and we are working. We want reconciliation in this country, but we don't want to reconcile because someone is pointing a gun at us, say, okay, now you reconcile. We don't want to do that. We don't want that Damocles sword to be hung on our head and say, reconcile. No, we have to reconcile because it is important for us. It is important for our society. So with this background, we have created some foreign policy directives with the national interest, national security, and national prosperity in keeping in our heart. That is how we look for the future. I will not go because these are 20-point foreign policy directive. For the first time in our history, we have a written down document regarding our foreign policy. We never had one earlier. Now we have that guide us, right? So I will not dwell too much on that because time is also running. So ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I can say we have a great nation and we have great resilience. Tsunami came and went, we overcame that. Large-scale floods, we overcame that. 30-year-old war, we overcame that. Easter bombing, we overcame that. We are a country with great resilience. So we must never ever give up hope. We should hope that we will come back. We will bounce back. We have issues like many other countries. Now, the strength of this country is unity of people. We are a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. So unity of people is of critical importance. The moment we are divided, we become vulnerable and we are exposed to outside interference. So it is in our interest that we have a peaceful, harmonious society. This is in our interest because we don't want to be vulnerable. We need to be united. We want to be peaceful. We want to have a stable one nation. So in this endeavor, the long journey that we have taken, we salute great heroes like late General Denzil Kobbekadua. As I mentioned, if that fateful incident did not happen on that day, the history of Sri Lanka would be different. So with this, once again, I pay my greatest respect to the war hero, late General Denzil Kobbekadua, an officer par excellence, a great patriot, great leader, and a brave son of Sri Lanka. And I'm delighted that I was invited to deliver this talk, and I am so happy. I have the presence of Madam Lali Kobbekadua and the family, and also our great friends here. So once again, I wish you all the very best, and I wish you a very pleasant evening. Thank you.